Lieutenant Armin's boots crunched through the fresh snow as he trudged toward the old communications relay. The wind howled like a wounded creature across the barren plain, whipping the white drifts into ragged shapes. The outpost little. More than a half-buried dome of ice-scarred metal stood silent, its once bright panels dulled by frost. Supply runs this far from human space were never easy, but today felt colder, harsher than before. Through the swirling flakes, Armand spotted something that made his chest tighten. A lone figure slumped on the ice, motionless. The shape was wrapped in layers of heavy armor, the style of the legendary Iron Clans who had refused any alliance with the humans. Rumors said the clansmen bore unbreakable discipline. They never showed weakness, never begged for help. Yet here she was, collapsed and alone in a storm that could kill a man in minutes, heart pounding. Armand hurried forward, mindful of how quickly the cold could steal warmth. He knelt beside her, gently brushing snow from the visor of her helmet. Frost clung to the edges, hiding sharp, unreadable features. He tapped her shoulder, no response. He tugged at the blanket roll strapped to his pack, his only extra suppliant, unfastened it in one smooth motion. The blanket was thin, woven. By his mother before he left Earth, piece of home he carried like a silent prayer. With care, he spread it over the clanswoman's shoulders. The fabric was rough, but warm, and a faint glow of color in this sea of white. The woman stiffened, her fingers tightening on the metal arm plates, but she did not push him away. Armin's breath fogged in front of him as he leaned back to watch. Her, willing her to accept this simple gift of warmth? Lightning-bright pain lanced through his leg. A hidden crack in the ice butt, he ignored it. All that mattered was this woman, this warrior who still wore the fire of her people in every line of her posture. He swept off his own insulated jacket, layering it over the blanket, and then offered his hand. "Can you stand?" he asked. Voice low but steady, kept his distance, respecting her space. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her helmet tilted and Armand caught a glimpse of green eyes sharp and wary before she snapped it shut again. She tested her weight, then rose with a hiss of pain. He supported her arm, careful not to touch the bare skin beneath the plates. Each breath she took was shallow, as if the storm had grounded her courage along with her body. Armand guided her toward the ruined dome entrance. Every step was a silent pact. He would not leave her here to freeze. With the blanket wrapped around her, she moved more steadily. Though her armor still bore dents and scorched marks evidence of battles waged and survived. He wondered what story lay behind each scar. Inside the dome, the wind's roar dimmed to a mournful moan. Shards of broken circuitry and shattered glass littered the floor. Armand. He lit a stove and filled a battered kettle with melted snow. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of clean water. The clanswoman sat on a crate, arms folded over the blanket. She refused to look at him, though he placed a cup of hot liquid. By her side, she inhaled the steam, closing her eyes as if it were an unfamiliar comfort. Armand watched her, his heart full of white-hot hope. Though their peoples stood apart here in this frozen desert, they shared the same need: warmth, safety, the gentle touch of kindness. He settled on a crate opposite her, careful not to crowd her. "My name is Armand," he said softly. "Hey." Silence stretched, but she did not speak. He poured 2 spoonfuls of water into the hot cup and handed it to her. She took it, fingers trembling, and raised it to her lips. Steam fogged her visor, and for a moment he saw something he had never seen on an Iron clanswoman. Relief outside, the storm raged on. Inside, under a borrowed blanket and beside a simple flame, 2 strangers began an unspoken truce. One act of compassion had bridged a chasm centuries wide. Armand did not know where this path would lead, but he was determined to walk it for both their sakes, one careful step at a time. Armand poked at the embers in the small stove until a steady flame glowed bright enough to chase the shadows from the ruined dome. He set a battered metal pot on top and poured in water to boil. The hiss of steam was a hopeful sound against the wind's distant howl. Across from him, Carice, still wrapped in the thin blanket, sat on a crate, her posture as tense as the day they first met. He ladled warm broth into 2 dented bowls and handed one to her. For a long moment, She simply stared at it. Her visor was streaked with frost, but he could see the flicker of hunger in her green eyes. Gently, he slid the bowl closer. She shifted, uncapping the helmet to sip the broth. The hot liquid soothed her throat, and her shoulders relaxed by inches. Armand cleared a flat patch of floor and arranged the few supplies he carried. A bar of dried meat, a handful of salted crackers, and half a packet of water tablets. He divided everything into small portions and offered them in turn. At first, Karis accepted only the crackers, nibbling slowly, as if afraid to eat too much. Yet with every bite, her breathing eased, and the rigid set of her shoulders softened. When they finished eating, Armand said, "Tell me about your journey." His voice was gentle. Karis frowned at him, then shook her head. The question hung in the air, unanswered. He realized asking too much too soon might push her away. Instead, he pointed at his boots, scuffed and worn. "Long walk," he said simply. She glanced down at his boots and nodded once, as if understanding. That hardship transcended borders. He rose and crossed the dome to examine a broken console. "Maybe we can fix the comms," he muttered, tapping a few keys. Sparks fizzled, but the screen stayed dark. Karis watched him move with precise efficiency. In her armor's every scratch, Armand saw a story of battles survived. He found a loose wire, soldered it with care, and the console clicked to life. Its pale green screen illuminating the frost around it. Karis's eyes widened. The lack of words between them suddenly felt like a bridge rather than a barrier. Armand smiled, wiped his hands on his trousers, and then pointed at the display, where a faded map of the sector appeared. "We need to reach Settlement 3, he said. She nodded again, more firmly this time. He handed her a flask of water, and when she took it, met her gaze. "We'll get there together." Outside, the wind rattled the dome's metal ribs. Inside, the heat from the stove gave the space a fragile peace. Armand built a small pile of scrap wood and metal shards, carefully arranging them in an old food crate. Karis watched him work, then rose and gathered leftover planks from the corner. She placed them beside the crate, her movements deliberate. When he looked up, she offered him a piece of wood. He took it, surprised by the small act of teamwork. They worked side by side, feeding the fire until it roared with life. The blaze cast dancing shadows that turned the broken dome into a place of warmth and promise. Armand leaned against the stove, studying Karis. Her armor still gleamed with dents and scorch marks, but her eyes no longer held the same wariness. Instead, they reflected the firelight, bright, curious, and alive. As the heat spread, Armand retrieved a folded cloth from his pack. It was his mother's scarf, soft, faded blue. Out he draped it around the top of the stove, thinking it might lend more warmth to the air. Karis watched him, and for the first time, she allowed a faint smile to tug at her mouth. It was a small thing, but in that moment, Armand felt hope bloom in his chest. Night deepened, and the storm outside grew fiercer, but within the dome. A new bond formed over shared meals, tentative smiles, and quiet cooperation. Two strangers, soldier and warrior, began to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow survivors. When at last they lay side by side on a makeshift bunk of crates and blankets, Karis reached out and touched Armand's hand. He squeezed hers gently. In the hush between the storm's roars, they found warmth that went deeper than fire, beginning neither had expected, born of kindness and trust. As dawn broke over the frozen plain, Armand and Karis stepped out of the ruined dome, the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a fragile banner of hope. The wind had softened overnight, but each breath still tasted of ice and steel, and the path ahead was treacherous with hidden cracks in the shifting snow. Armand moved carefully, scanning the ground with his boots before each step, while Karis followed a pace just behind him, her armor's plate joints creaking softly as she walked. Despite the chill, a quiet warmth had settled between them overnight. Warmth born not only of the fire, but of shared silence and simple kindness. With each cautious footfall, Karis's fingers brushed the blanket's edge, tracing the faded patterns with a gentle curiosity that had not been there before. Armin noticed and spoke quietly. It was my mother's blanket. She wove it herself before she passed. Karis paused, tilting her head to one side, the first real question she had shown. Ah. He hesitated, then continued. She made it for me, when I was small, to keep me warm on winter nights. I never imagined I'd share it with anyone else. The words seemed to settle in the cold air, and Karis's footsteps slowed as if she were weighing them in her mind. The landscape around them was starkly beautiful in last white fields broken by spindly rock outcroppings, and Armin pointed to a low ridge in the distance that marked the halfway point to Settlement 3. We rest there, said, and Karis nodded, her breath forming small clouds that drifted away like ghosts. As they climbed the ridge, the wind gusted stronger, tugging at the blanket and at Karis's hood. Armand reached out, gently steadying her elbow. For the first time, she did not tense under his touch. Instead, her visor lifted, and he saw her. Face uncovered, sharp cheekbones dusted with frost. Lips pressed into a line of concentration, and eyes that held both pain and pride. He offered her the water flask, and she drank, her hands steady now, no longer trembling. When she passed it back, their fingers met briefly, and something vital passed between them, a fragile trust. Near the crest of the ridge, Karis stopped and drew a slow breath. Armand waited, sensing her resolve. She lowered her voice, speaking in her clipped tongue, Mavrin. The single word hung in the air like a prayer. Armand's heart leaped gratitude. He smiled and said her name aloud. Karis. Her visor lifted again in surprise, then she lowered her head, accepting her own name spoken by another. He felt a surge of honor, as if she had offered him a secret part of herself. Together they reached the ridge's top and paused to look. Back at the path they had taken, the dome now a gray scar in the endless white landscape, Karis adjusted the blanket, wrapping it more tightly around both of them, and the small gesture warmed Armin's chest. The storm clouds that had chased them seemed to break at that moment, revealing a pale sun that glowed like a promise on the horizon. Though the world remained cold and unforgiving, in that shared silence on the ridge, two strangers became companions. Held together by a mother's gift, a warrior's gratitude, and the quiet hope that even in the darkest places, kindness could light the way. Armand woke before dawn, the lean-to barely holding back the cold wind. Karis still slept beside him, the blanket tucked around her shoulders like a guardian's cloak. He watched her chest rise and fall, each breath steady and calm. He felt a surge of protectiveness. In their shared silence, he realized she had become more than a companion. She was someone he cared for deeply. Outside the hall, the refugee camp stirred to life. Cries of hungry children mixed with the clatter of makeshift cooking pots. Armin stood and stretched, mindful of his throbbing leg, and Karis woke at the same moment. Her green eyes met his, and without words they agreed to help. The blanket now faded and stained lay across their lean-to floor, a silent promise of warmth to share. They stepped into the morning light together. The camp was a tangle of tents and broken vehicles sewn together with tarps, faces gaunt, with cold and fear turned toward them. Armin carried a small pile of wood, and Karis held her pack of rations. Their arrival brought curiosity, but no hostility. These people had learned that kindness was rare in this frozen world. A small boy tugged at Armin's sleeve, eyes bright with hope. He pointed at the blanket. Armin knelt, opened his pack, and drew out a packet of dried fruit. He offered it with a smile. The boy's lips curved in a shy grin as he accepted the fruit. Karis watched him, her stern armor forgotten. Then she reached for the blanket and draped it over the boy's shoulders. His face lit up as warmth spread across him. Nearby, a young mother shielded her crying infant from the wind. Armand set down his wood and knelt beside her, unzipped his jacket and offered it. She hesitated, but when he nodded, she wrapped the jacket around her baby. Karis moved to help gather firewood, her armor clinking softly. Each plank she carried, Armand felt proud of her. Her strength was fierce, but her heart was even stronger. When they returned to the center of the camp, settlers crowded around the fire pits. Karis took the blanket and bound it around her waist, like a short cloak, then knelt to share leftover broth with an elderly man who coughed in the cold air. Armand handed him the bowl, and the man's tired eyes shone with gratitude. Karis patted his hand, her stern face softening. Armand saw something change in her. Her armor had walls, but her kindness had no boundary. As the sun climbed, they worked side by side, building a larger fire with the wood Armand had gathered. Flames leapt up, scattering sparks into the pale sky. Children danced around the blaze, their laughter a sound neither soldier nor warrior had heard in years. Karis and Armand exchanged a brief glance and smiled, their shared warmth now lighting the hearts of many. By midday, the camp felt more like a community. Karis helped distribute blankets and rations, while Armand organized patrols to guard against scavengers. They moved through the tents together, their steps in sync, each glance a silent conversation. At one point, Armand faltered and Karis caught his arm. Their fingers brushed, and neither looked away. In that moment, the hard line between them softened completely. As dusk fell, the camp settled into quiet. Fires glowed like scattered stars. Across the snow, Armand and Karis returned to their lean-to, where the blanket now smaller from each gift lay folded between them. They sat close, sharing the last of their broth. Karis began to hum that ancient melody again, and Armand joined in, his voice low and steady. Their song of compassion echoed in the cold night. Before sleep claimed them, Karis placed the blanket in Armand's lap. "Keep it," she said softly in her clipped tongue. He understood. This blanket was more than warmth. It was their journey, their bond, and the promise of hope. Armand nodded, his heart full. Together, under the fragile shelter of wood and cloth, soldier and warrior dreamed of a future where kindness would conquer even the harshest storm. A sharp alarm cut through the morning's quiet in the camp, and Armand snapped awake. He sat up just as Karis stirred beside him, eyes narrowing at the distant shouts. Smoke curled above the tents. Raiders had come. Armand rose, every muscle taut with fear and resolve. Karis was already pulling on her gauntlets, her armor plates clinking softly. The blanket lay forgotten at her feet. Together, they stepped into the fray. Two allies bound by the warmth they had shared, the raiders burst through the camp's flimsy barricades. Desperate shapes cloaked in ragged furs. Children screamed, and mothers gathered infants close. Armand drew his sidearm, firing precise bursts to scatter the attackers. Karis moved like a tempest. Her blade flashed in the dim light, each strike driven by fierce protectiveness. She fought not for glory, but for the people huddled behind the shelters. The same people she had warmed with that thin blanket only hours before. One raider lunged at Armand from the flank. But Karis intercepted with perfect timing. She caught his arm and twisted him off balance, sending him sprawling into the snow. Armand's pulse thundered in his ears as he covered her back, eyes locked on the survivors. Sweat beaded on Karis's brow despite the cold. Every breath she took was a vow to defend those who could not defend themselves. In her fierce gaze, Armand found both pride and love. A sudden explosion rocked the center of the camp, sending debris flying. Armand felt a burning sting in his shoulder, the flash of a grenade's blast. He stumbled, and Karis was at his side. In an instant, she half-dragged, half-carried him toward the makeshift barracks. Her armor was scuffed, and in one panel a dark red stain spread like a bloom. Pain throbbed through Armand's side, but his heart swelled at her devotion. She would not leave him. Inside the barracks, wounded settlers moaned quietly on straw-filled mattresses. Karis laid Armand on the floor and knelt beside him, peeling back his jacket to inspect the wound. The cut was deep, but clean. She tore a strip from her undershirt once more and bound it firmly. Her fingers gentle as a healer's. Armand's breath caught when she pressed her palm against his side. He closed his eyes, trusting her completely. Outside, the last raider fell. A hush descended on the camp, broken only by distant sobs and the crackle of dying fires. Karis rose, blade in hand, and surveyed the scene. Ash drifted like snowflakes as the survivors emerged, wide-eyed but safe. Armand watched her, awe and gratitude shining in his gaze. She dropped her blade and crossed to him, her face streaked. With soot and resolve, gingerly, Armand reached for the blanket folded at the foot of the bedroll. He draped it over both their shoulders. Karis looked down at it, then into his eyes, and a single tear traced a line through the grime on her cheek. In that moment, the blanket was no longer just cloth. It was their shield, their bond, and the promise that they would always protect each other. As the survivors gathered around, Karis helped Armand sit up against the wall. He leaned on her, and she supported him without a word. One by one, the settlers brought fresh bandages and water. Children peered from behind broken boards, and Karis offered a small, weary smile that spoke of victory and hope. Armand squeezed her hand. She rested her head against his shoulder. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp lay quiet and safe. Fires burned low, and the raiders were gone. Armand and Karis sat side by side, sharing what little broth remained. The blanket lay wrapped tightly around them, a symbol of endurance through storm and battle. In the gentle glow of the embers, two souls, soldier and warrior, found a deeper warmth than any fire could give, the warmth of trust, sacrifice, and a love forged in the coldest of battles. Dawn painted the sky in pale pink as Armand and Karis prepared to leave Settlement 3. The camp survivors moved about in renewed hope, tending fires and sharing blankets. Karis stood before them, the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Like a banner of strength, she held out a folded strip of cloth to the camp elder. As he took it, his eyes filled with tears. In that small exchange, Armand saw how one simple gift had changed many lives. Karis gathered her pack and slung it over her shoulder. Armand strapped his wounded side with fresh bandages and fastened the small iron insignia she had given him. It rested against his heart, a reminder of her trust. They paused at the camp's edge, looking back at the tents that bustled with new energy. Karis touched Armand's arm, and he nodded. Both knew they could linger, but their journey was not yet complete. They walked in quiet companionship along the snow-packed road. Each breath left small clouds that drifted upward and vanished. Neither spoke for a long time. Words felt too heavy for the moment. Instead, they listened to the crunch of their boots and watched the world awaken around them. Though the landscape was icy and white, in their hearts bloomed warmth and purpose. Together, they carried the camp's hope forward into the vast unknown. Mid-morning light glinted off distant spires of rock. Karis paused and removed her helmet, letting her hair fall in dark waves around her face. Armand looked at her, struck again by how fierce yet gentle she could be. She smiled, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. He returned her smile and offered the blanket. Karis shook her head, then wrapped it around Armand instead. He accepted it gratefully, feeling its worn fibers like a living memory. As they crossed a frozen creek, Armand stumbled on a hidden dip. He braced himself on Karis's shoulder. She steadied him, her armor's cool metal grounding him in the present. For a moment they stood close, sharing the blanket and the silent promise of protection. Armand looked into Karis's green eyes and saw no armor, their only kindness and fierce loyalty. He placed his hand over hers and squeezed gently. They climbed a gentle rise, and ahead lay the human fleet's outriders, sleek, gray ships parked on the ice. Engineers bustled around engines, preparing for the next supply convoy. Armand's heart quickened. This world of metal and stars was his home, but it felt incomplete without Karis by his side. She mirrored his hesitation, her jaw set with determination. Together, they would bridge to worlds. At the fleet's edge, officers stepped forward to greet Armand. He introduced Karis, officials pausing at her ironclad's armor. Karis raised her chin and spoke in her clipped tone, now fluent in galactic command. The officers listened. In her voice, they heard respect and unity. Armand watched, pride swelling in his chest. The woman who once refused his blanket now stood as his equal and ambassador. After formalities, Armand and Karis slipped away to the observation deck. They looked out over the endless ice and sky. Karis unwrapped the blanket and laid it flat on the floor between them. Armin knelt and placed the iron insignia in the blanket's center, then folded the cloth around it like a gift. He rose and offered it to Karis. She unfolded it, revealing the badge against the soft fabric. Her lips curved in a tender smile. Armin stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. The cold wind blew around them, but they felt unshakable. Karis draped the blanket over both their shoulders. He slipped an arm around her waist, and she leaned into him. In that silent embrace, they shared all they had learned, that kindness could thaw the hardest armor, that trust could build bridges between strangers, that two hearts could find warmth even in the coldest places. As the fleet's engines rumbled awake, Karis and Armand turned toward the horizon. Their path was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges. But they would face it together, bound by a simple blanket and an unbreakable bond. With one final look at the rising sun, they stepped forward into the light, ready to carry there a story of hope and compassion to every corner of the galaxy. As the sun climbed higher in the pale sky, Armand and Karis trudged down the ridge toward Settlement 3. The makeshift banner of the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders and trailing behind him like a fragile flag. The cold bit at their faces, but neither spoke of the chill. Instead, they focused on every careful step over the uneven ice. Karis led the way, her heavy boots cracking thin layers of frost, and Armand followed close behind, eyes scanning for hidden fissures. The path was narrow, hemmed in by jagged ice formations that caught the morning light and glowed like broken glass. Despite the danger, Karis walked with calm precision, her warrior's training guiding each movement. Armand felt a swell of admiration for her quiet strength, and in his heart he carried the warmth of her trust. About halfway down the slope, the ice beneath Armand's left foot groaned like a warning. He paused, shifting his weight to the right boot, but in that instant the ground split in a sharp crack. A hidden crevasse yawned at his ankle, and he lost his balance. His foot plunged into the narrow gap, and pain shot up his leg as frozen walls bit into his calf. He cried out, clutching at Karis's arm for support. Without hesitation, she dropped the blanket at her feet and knelt beside him. Her visor lifted, and her green eyes burned with fierce concern. Armand felt the panic rising in his chest, but her steady hand on his shoulder anchored him. "Hold tight," she said in a low voice that carried more kindness than he had ever heard in any warrior's tone. Armand nodded, teeth clenched against the stabbing pain. Karis reached into her pack and drew out a coil of rope. She placed one end around his waist, looping it firm and sure, and then braced her feet against the icy walls. "Lean back," she ordered gently. Armand did as she instructed, and with a grunt of effort, Karis heaved him free of the crevasse. He tumbled onto the ice beside her, heart pounding and breath ragged. She knelt to inspect his leg, then helped him sit against a sharp rock outcrop. Armand pulled aside his trouser leg to reveal bruising that already bloomed like dark flowers. Against his skin, Karis tore a strip from her own undershirt and wrapped it around his calf, pressing lightly to stem swelling. Every movement she made was careful, controlled, like a healer rather than a fighter. He winced, but met her gaze with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. She brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, as if embarrassed by the tenderness. Between them, but her eyes stayed soft. "We all need help sometimes," she replied. As the afternoon sun dipped low, the wind began to rise, carrying fine snow that blurred the horizon. Armin leaned into Karis's warmth, the blanket now draped over both of them like a shared shield. His leg throbbed, but the pain faded under the comfort of her presence. She hummed a quiet tune in her clipped tongue, a melody that felt ancient and sad, and Armin closed his eyes to listen. In that simple song, he sensed her story, the battles she had fought, the losses she had borne, and the lonely pride she had carried beneath her unbreakable armor. By the time they reached the outskirts of Settlement 3, the wind had turned savage, and the few buildings that remained stood like battered sentinels against the storm. Armin stumbled, but Karis caught him, steadying his weight.
Together.
They crossed the frozen courtyard and slipped inside a half-collapsed hall that offered shelter. Inside, the air was still and smelled of dust and old wood. Armin sank to the ground, leaning back against a beam. Karis knelt beside him, wrapping the blanket tighter and adjusting the makeshift bandage on his leg. She laid her hand on his shoulder, and he felt every line of tension melt from his muscles. "Rest," she said simply. Armin nodded, and as his eyelids grew heavy, he realized how much he had come to trust her, this warrior who once would not accept a gift of warmth, and now offered him comfort at his lowest moment. Karis moved to the edge of the hall and pulled a broken wooden door from its hinges, fashioning a crude lean-to against the wind. She gathered loose boards and piled them to block the drafts. When she returned, her armor bore fresh scratches, but in her eyes, there was no regret, only purpose. They sat side by side in the dim light, the wind's howl muffled by the door and the battered walls. The blanket cocooned them both, a thin line of color in the gray gloom. Armin shifted until his head rested on Karis's shoulder, and she did not move away. In that quiet moment, two strangers, soldier and warrior, found solace in each other's company. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, by the glow of a single flare Armin lit, they discovered that courage meant more than steel and armor, meant opening one's heart to another soul, even in the coldest of places.